Hello, I'm John Self, and today on Self Perspective, we're going to focus on building an interim executive practice, also known as on-demand executives. Our guest is Mike Lieb, a veteran in the on-demand executive field who has enjoyed a successful and rewarding career working in complex, large hospitals as well as critical access facilities across America. A native of the Northeast, he grew up in Austin, where he says, "I learned how to crawl and draw." A graduate of Rice University with a master's degree from Trinity University, Mike and his wife now live in Dallas. So join us for this self-perspective interview and learn more about building an interim executive practice. Mike, thank you for joining us today. Tell me a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up? Mom, dad, brothers, and sisters?
Well, thanks, John. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate you asking me too. I was technically born in New London, Connecticut, but my father took a job as a philosophy professor down at UT Austin. We moved down when I was about 6 months old. So I consider myself a Texan. I learned to crawl and learned to drawl down there. He spent years there, ultimately as graduate dean, and then on out to USC in California. But I grew up in Austin back when it was a small town.
Do you have brothers and sisters?
I have one natural brother. I'm actually the oldest of 6 boys. My parents split at one point, and my mother got remarried, and there are 6 boys, all within 7 years of age. So she earned her stripes. She also made us learn how to cook and plan things right from the beginning. I still don't know how she did it. And the first phrase I always hear when I tell people that is, "Oh, your poor mother." So
where did you go to undergraduate?
I went to Rice in Houston.
Did you know what you wanted to do? Your dad was at Austin, you go to Rice, which is, I guess it's kind of, is that an easy school to get into?
It was easier to get into than it was to get out of. But I originally went in as an architecture major and then discovered that I was not physics and higher math were not my strong suits. Ultimately, I became the only undergraduate marine biology major they ever had, which is a completely unmarketable degree. I did end up working for a couple of years at an imaging center down in Austin after graduating, and I became chief tech, radiation safety officer, and so on, clinic administrator while I was waiting actually to get into the Coast Guard. And this was during the 80s. There was a budget freeze. My slot was pulled back. So I thought, I kind of like this healthcare stuff. Went to Trinity in San Antonio for grad school and wanted for the residency program a big, ugly public hospital. I was offered a slot at Parkland in Dallas, which I found my big, ugly public hospital, but I will tell you, it was absolutely the most fun I've ever had in my career. You get to see everything. And the philosophy was, if you can handle it at Parkland, you can handle it anywhere. And I think that set me up pretty well. I also was fortunate to meet my wife at Rice. And having grown up in Austin, hating the Aggies, being Rice grads, my wife and I, all three of our children are Aggies, and it's been wonderful for them. So
what do you like the most about healthcare?
Part of it, I like the complexity, but generally speaking, you get to work with the smartest people on the planet. And they're compassionate, frustrated often because there are internal bureaucracies and politics, and any big organization is going to have them. But I like the caliber of the people that I work with, and knowing at the end of the day that whatever it is we do, whatever role you have, it's an organism, not an organization. So all the pieces have to work. And part of the fun is pulling all that together, knowing at the end of the day, yeah, I did something good for somebody. So
Drucker once said that hospitals are the most complex business structure ever designed by a human being. So tell me your take on that, and then tell me what you like the least about the healthcare or hospital side of the business.
There are so many moving pieces to get a patient into the system, treated, cared for, bill paid, bill sent on through the system, and to ensure that they're handed off cleanly. It's just an incredibly complex organization. By the same token, it's again very rewarding to navigate those pieces correctly. There's an internal inertia in any large organization. You know, I'm presently at a state-owned trauma facility in the Northeast, and there are state bureaucracies, there are political issues between, you know, the hospital and the medical school and the faculty and the chairs, and making day-to-day progress is sometimes difficult. On the other hand, when you get those daily victories, and there are some, you can really have a profound effect, and that makes it fun.
Now, my understanding is you are there as an executive on demand.
Yes.
And your responsibilities, without violating anything confidential for the organization, what are you doing for that organization?
I was brought up here to look at their entire ambulatory structure, clinics primarily, and see what we can do to maximize access and throughput and efficiency. It is a hugely busy place, constrained like everywhere with space and staffing, and but my task is to enhance their access basically across the system.
Not to encourage you to bite the hand that feeds, but if you had a fresh sort of page, what would you do to make healthcare more efficient, less complex, better quality, better service?
First of all, would be to streamline the financial flows. We have a unique environment in healthcare where we play with other people's money. The patients, if they're insured, and even if they're not, They're not generally spending their own money, so they're often not terribly cost conscious about which way we go. The financial incentives for both the facilities, the practitioners, and so on are all aligned, to my mind, in odd directions that makes for sort of an inherent confusing jumble. I think it's way too complicated. And if we could carve out some of the, my favorite word, administrivia, out of the services, we could actually do a whole lot more with the folks we have.
Frequently, you hear physicians say, I wouldn't want my child to go into healthcare today for anything. Typically, that's said through the lens of being a physician and how that part of the system is changing. Your kids are well on their way to having great, productive lives. And congratulations on the wedding, by the way.
Thank you.
Would you, if you had a child that came to you and said, you know, should I look at healthcare as a career? What would your advice be?
Well, first of all, I have one who's interested in that. She is, my youngest is an industrial engineering major about to graduate. She's lined up a future job, but she's heard me over the decades talk about broken processes and organizational flows, operational stuff, which is exactly what she's studying as an industrial engineer. And shortly after I got to my current engagement, I kept saying, I need an engineer in here. And she said, okay, I've been listening to this. I could come and help you. So there are pathways in, I think, for almost any background here because of the diversity of the organizations. She's interested in it. I would love to have her in, you know, maybe join me as part of a family business at some day. But you have to have a thick skin in this field. And a lot of it is not personal. It's just complicated. And sometimes you bang your head against the wall, but sometimes you get a breakthrough and really good things can happen. So I wouldn't discourage anyone, but you have to know what you're going into to the degree
it's not an industry eyes wide shut.
No, not at all. So
talk to me about your progression and how you sort of the jobs you took, how that moved forward.
Sure. So I did my residency year at Parkland, and I was invited to stay on by Ron Anderson, the CEO there at the time, as, for lack of a better word, the designated hitter. So I was the projects coordinator, and I would be pointed at something and say, Mike, go fix this. And he asked me, you know, I'm dating myself now, to go take a look at the value of professional services provided by the UT Southwestern Radiology Department. This was when RVUs were just coming out. That's how old I am. So I did a fairly extensive dive into all this, and there wasn't much literature on this at the time. I convinced Parkland they were underpaying for professional services to the tune of about $4 million a year, which made me incredibly popular with the chairman of radiology, who turned right around and offered me a job. Dr. Anderson at that point said, Mike, I think you probably ought to take this one. So I moved 50 yards away over to the medical school, as I refer to it, a light year in style, and took over the management of the radiology practice. And I was very fortunate to work with a chairman there who said, I'll take care of the academic stuff, you take care of everything else. I spent 7 years at the medical school, covering all sorts of things, including trying to negotiate deals to buy parts of the superconducting super collider as it was being unfinished and dismantled. It was a fantastic opportunity to work with, as I mentioned before, kind of the smartest people on the planet in an academic medical center. But I missed the hospitals, and a former classmate of mine from Trinity called and said, well, why don't you come over to Methodist with me? So I moved over there as a vice president, sort of the rookie vice president, the classic role of facilities maintenance, food service, but I also had surgery and family practice and CME and the graduate programs. It was a pretty broad mandate, and construction too, which is always a great deal of fun. Was there for a bit. We systematized the Methodist system, and I became the system VP for all the clinical ancillary services, radiology, pharmacy, path, and respiratory across the system, and got to do a number of construction projects, and ultimately got lured away to a hospital in East Texas that was supposed to build a replacement facility. And that's one of those fun things an administrator doesn't get to do very often. Shortly after I got there, discovered that the HUD funding that was supposed to make this possible wasn't coming, was never going to come. And I told my wife, we're not moving, I'll commute. And that's how I became a road warrior, which I'm sure we'll get to in a bit. But I was promoted to CEO there shortly after I got there. And that was an interesting environment because the facility was on the wrong side of the highway. It was away from a beautiful Christus facility that had all the physicians sitting nearby. And we were in a giant empty building, basically. And I had to take it through a bankruptcy, which is not something they typically teach you in grad school.
You went to build a new hospital, which is something that a lot of CEOs don't get a chance to do. And a lot of CEOs, fortunately, don't get a chance to learn bankruptcy.
That's true. Yeah,
so you swap one for the other.
Yeah. I tell people that was the hardest work I ever did in my career, but it was also the most rewarding. It was a really good save.
So I'm guessing that when you went over there, when you were recruited there was less than full disclosure about the stability of the organization.
That's probably fair.
Okay. So how long did it take you to get that sorted out? I mean, you went to be the COO, you find out they're having significant financial trouble, the CEO leaves, you get left with the whatever we want to call it. How long did it take you to turn that around?
It was about a year and a half at that point. And I had excellent advisory help from outside firms. But it was very difficult. At the end, though, we sold it to a management company, and it was a good save. There were about 770 people reporting to me. All but 3 kept their jobs. That was me, the in-house attorney, and the foundation director. Everybody else got to stay. And I consider that one of the big wins of the career. And I must have done something right, because then that management company hired me to go out to one of their facilities as interim on the day they emerged from bankruptcy. So I became the turnaround guy, and followed on after that with, I think this is now my 15th interim engagement where I am now.
Mike, I want to backtrack into your interim career. You left, you were in a stable Methodist hospital. You make a decision to go help this hospital. Things aren't as they represent it, which happens periodically in a lot of industries. You learn not how to build a hospital, but how to take one out of bankruptcy. You become the turnaround guy for the company that acquired the hospital. Tell me about how that progressed. What were a lot of the hospitals and clinics you were working with at that company?
Most of those were critical access or close to it, small PPS facilities. And most of them, I went in as interim CEO. Typically smaller places than actually the one I had come from. And that was a bit of an eye-opener as well. I did discover that the issues are the same, the resource issues are the same. There is just a difference in scale sometimes, but also the support you have to do things. So the work is just as hard. It's also just as rewarding, but it's a little different scale when you're
at a small. Mainly it's
me.
Yes.
And a good team of leaders. So.
It is interesting. Somebody said, that large community hospital, you can make a mistake, strategic mistake, and cash flow covers a multitude of sins.
For a while.
If you make a mistake in a rural community hospital, you're going to be explaining that mistake at the next board meeting.
Absolutely.
Because it's going to show up on the bottom line.
And to the community.
When you dealt with a lot of those hospitals and you were doing turnarounds and interim work, what were some of the issues that you were seeing that were pretty, not necessarily regulatory, but that were pretty common?
Sure.
Operational challenges.
Most of them, cash flow is almost always tight. There generally does not tend to be a lot of deep reserves. Some had them. Quite often, these were district or governmental owned, county owned facilities where you didn't have a whole lot of extra slack in the rope, but you were also typically the only player and the only healthcare institution in your area, region, town, whatever it happens to be. And consequently, there's a duty to do everything you can to keep that place alive and well. The other thing I will say, though, is those district hospitals with elected boards tend to be very political. And it does take not only a bit of a thick skin, but some political savvy to figure out how to negotiate that. And especially in a smaller community, somebody's ox gets gored no matter where you are, and you have to figure out who that's likely to be and be prepared for it. But it is also part of the fun. So
my understanding is that after you did a lot of interim work, then you became a regional executive and supported multiple hospitals. Mm-hmm. How many board meetings did you attend every month?
Oh, gosh. At least 6, but then there were usually prep meetings before that, not only with the local CEOs, but with the board chairs as well. So there were a lot of air miles, and there were a lot of time in the car. And fortunately for Siri, you can talk and drive at the same time. So, but yes, an awful lot of meetings.
How many times a month were you traveling?
I was typically gone during that period, 3 to 5 days a week for 3 weeks out of the month.
So you finally decided, like I did in executive search after 27 years, that you had all of that fun you could stand going to the airport, and figure that interim, going back to your traditional interim role, you would still travel some, but it was going to be weekly or every other week in just to one location.
Typically every other
not
week.
6.
Not 6. I saw many small little airports and I saw a lot of places I never would have seen otherwise. But yes, my current structure is typically every other week. And I'm fortunate, at least in this one, I can catch a direct flight from Dallas. So that's the advantage to living in the middle of the country. You can get anywhere. What
hospital, you don't have to name it by city by name, what was the toughest place you had to get to every month when you were the regional vice president?
There was one in Oregon that required, until American Airlines changed their flight patterns, 2 flights and then a 3.5-hour drive. So
my hardest one was up in Oregon, Northeast Oregon, and it was a flight up to Boise and then a 3.5-hour drive. And I remember that one because it was a gorgeous place to go. Incredible community, incredible community, incredible people, and Grand Ron up in the valley, and just an incredible facility. But going up, you change time zones, and you passed, I think, the 45th parallel or something, where you were.
You crossed the bridge.
Yeah. So you're right there. I mean, I'd never had that happen before, and I've gone to some pretty remote places. So it was always a treat when I did, and I did probably 40% of my searches in metropolitan areas, 60% where I did a lot of rural hospitals like you, and it was always a treat to be able to be in a big city.
It is. I'm actually enjoying it, and I'm close to New York City now. So on the weekends, I can when I'm up here, I can hop on the train and go over and explore. But,
Yes, great. Great New Jersey train system.
hey, it works. It's better than Dallas. So,
What did you enjoy the most about that rural job?
uh, part of it was the value on a personal level. One, I was in some very cool places that I'd never been before. Two, you get to be the first or second largest, get to run the first or second largest employer in these communities. So you're intimately involved with kind of everything going on in the town. But you also have that critical mission to do. So while I got to go sightsee a lot, I also got to do things that had real value at the end of the day. And my mission as an interim was always very simple. I want to leave it better than I found it.
You're now you're an interim now. And I noticed that some of the big search firms are now getting involved in this business, and they've changed the terminology to say on demand.
Yeah, I noticed that.
Is this a transition role for you, or is this a role that you see for the rest of your career?
Oh, I see it as for the rest of the career. And actually, I have done things like that. It's really, for me, and actually I think industry wide, it's not a temp job. Interim leadership, or on-demand leadership now, I guess, is it really is a permanent career choice. I like it for the reason that there's a good variety in what I do. I am a believer in there are about only 7 basic plot lines, and once you figure out what the local structure is, you can navigate within it. But by the same token, they're different places, they're different cultures, different local issues. So it's always varied. And but I've talked about these things before. A professional interim, for lack of a better word, we're not just filling a gap between the next permanent job. We're not job jumpers. It's what we do. And the goal really is to bring help to an institution that needs targeted expertise quickly, and who can come in, do a differential diagnosis, figure out what's broken, and go attack it quickly, because they need help. And by the time these institutions tend to recognize they need help, they're pretty far into an issue generally. No, we're not bomb throwers or hatchet men or any of that stuff either. It's
if somebody wanted to get into this business, what do you think, from a general skill set point of view and a mindset point of view, what do you think are essential to be successful in this business?
Part of it, you do have to have some varied experience. You have to be able to be a leader. So there's a certain amount of gravitas, I think, that comes with just time in service. You don't get to be a sergeant in the Army without putting your years in and seeing what's going on. At the same time, sergeants run the Army. It is also you have to have a little bit of political astuteness, but at the same time, enough gravitas for the people, your boards or the physicians or whomever, to recognize that, okay, you do bring targeted expertise to the table. At the same time, my original plan was I'd wait until I got into my mid-60s and go do 6 months a year, and my wife and I would travel and so on. I fell into this in my 40s because of the bankruptcy hospital, and I was a road warrior then. So, 15, 16 years ago, by accident, but fell in love with the work. And one of the consultants who helped us through the bankruptcy said, this is going to get under your skin. And when I hung out my shingle to do interim work shortly after that, he called me and said, I knew it. I told you were going to go do this, because it really is fun. You can make an impact fast. And
Mike, when you got into this business, did you create an LLC or a corporate structure to operate in?
I did not. And I have seen sort of a 50-50 split among fellow interims. No, most of mine were either as independent contractors or through one of the management firms, in which case you're either an IC through them or a W-2, and I don't much care either way.
Do you not worry about liability issues?
No, because generally, if you go through a firm, and most of mine were either through that management company where I actually set up their interim service, or one of the big firms, you write into the interim placement agreement that you're a named insured, and you get covered under their D&O policy. So that's a requirement. I don't actually carry separate insurance either for myself. I mean, an umbrella policy, but always get in on the D&O coverage from the institution, because you're acting on their behalf.
When people want to get into this business, and I have people, and coaching people, they're asking me all the time, how does one set the fees? And how do you handle expenses? And how are living expenses handled? And how often do you get to go home? And who has to pay for all that?
Sure. Within a broad category, all of these things are fairly similar, whether you go through a placement firm or you negotiate it yourself. Excuse me. Typically, you travel home every other week. The client facility will pay for housing for that travel round trip. And it doesn't matter whether you go home or your spouse or family member comes to visit you, but you get 2 round trips a month typically. And either a per diem, which I like because it's tax-free, for meals and incidentals, but they'll pay housing, rental car, travel. That's pretty standard across the realm. Typically, the placement companies, they'll do the background checks and the drug screens and all that for you. Sometimes the client facility will do that on the front end. But it's a pretty standardized approach these days. And in terms of rate setting, it depends on the level you're going into, obviously. But I generally, when people have asked me this, have said, look at what that permanent placement person was earning, or what they're posting for the permanent search. And if it's, however many thousands, divide that by 200 work days a year and throw in a little bit of markup because you're responsible for your own tax rate. So, and then, just sort of base it somewhere in that ballpark. And I found you're not really out of range for most of that. I've underbid myself sometimes, and always regretted it a little bit, but you also don't want to price yourself out of the market. So I figure using that rough benchmark is pretty clean.
I know a lot of people who say, they worked for years and they've done placement. They said the only thing they don't like about it is they'll get a really good gig and be someplace 12 to 18 months. And then because they're tied up and out of sight, out of mind, it takes them another 6 to 8 months to find another gig. How do you offset that? How do you manage that gap time?
Well, that's really the key question for interim work. One, you have to keep the network up. I keep a very detailed spreadsheet of contacts and who I last talked to and when and where we left things. Most of the interim assignments have typically been 6 to 7 months.
They use LinkedIn to get maybe a connection established, but they use the blocking and tackling of traditional networking to build a relationship. And the relationship is what produces the businesses. Do you agree with that approach?
I do, actually. And I was fortunate, having been now in many different places and actually setting up an interim network or interim service myself, that I've got 1,500 or so people on the LinkedIn network, but I've had direct conversations with many of those folks and regular just check-ins. Hey, hadn't talked to you in a while. How you doing? What are you up to these days? Anything I can help with? And
it's not about you. It's always about helping others, correct?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And but it also doesn't hurt to say, I'm coming available here in the next I'm not unemployed at the moment. You got anything? I'm desperate. I'll be available here in the next couple of months. If you see something that might be a good fit for me, let me know. And that works. And then simultaneously, you have to get in everybody's interim pool, the B.E. Smiths of the world and Whit Kiefer and everybody else. And I even, when I was running an interim service, I would tell candidates, put your name in everybody's pool because you never know where the job's going to come from. You have to be ready to move fast. And if they contact you and say, hey, I've got one, and you say, it's not for me, there's no skin off anybody's nose. You're better off telling them this one's not right. But you actually then get to keep on their radar. And, every week or so, something will pop up. But if you want to stay busy, you have to milk that network. And then, I typically don't go but 3 or 4 weeks between an interim gig if I want one. So
it's interesting. There's a new thing out now. Well, it's been around for a while, but it's really getting us some traction. Video emails to cement that relationship. BombBomb's one. I use SendSpark, which is Austin based, and it's you're able to send it as a GIF it shows up as a video GIF in a DM on LinkedIn or any other DM that you use. Hey, Mike, it's great to see you. Just wanted to let you know I'll be available in 6 weeks. And if you hear anything, let me know. And anytime I can help you, just give me a call. Those messages are more likely to be open than text messages, and they're more likely to be remembered by a factor of 30 to 40% more often than text messages.
I actually believe that because people remember faces too. And, if you have a generic name like you and I do with Mike or John, everybody in the world has that. So it's like, which John was I talking to?
Yeah. One of the biggest challenges I think people face who want to get into this business. And it's like starting your own consulting practice, essentially.
It is.
As a friend who was a really, I won't mention her name because we both know her. She spent a lot of money to build a consulting company and spent a lot of money on beautiful graphics. And she's very clever and she's very smart. But she said, I just don't like that selly thing, the promotional part of it. And so if somebody not really doesn't enjoy that, it's tough to be in the interim business, isn't it?
Yes, it is, because you're always looking for the next spot. But by the same token, if you do good work, you'll get recommended as well. And cultivate your references, offer them back, and say, "Oh yeah, I worked with Mike years ago. I'd be happy to send him your way." Those help, but you do have to work it pretty regularly. I try and do an hour or so a week of updating, making sure my resume is current, that I've got several flavors worth for the kinds of things that I'm interested in or capable of doing. So.
And you're finding that when you have to prepare your resume for interim, it's actually going to a human and not some computer, correct?
Well, yes and no. There are, I think everything these days is being scraped by AI. So you have to have the keywords in there. And I learned that from you. But it is ultimately going to be targeted to
relationships,
the local relationship. Yeah.
Very good. If somebody came to you and said, I'm really interested in being an interim, what advice would you give them? Good points, bad points about this business?
The good, bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
Well, first of all,
it's always there. It's always there, regardless of what it is.
It's always there, and I've talked about these for ages. But you have to be patient to get the first gig. When I hung out my shingle after that bankruptcy, it probably took 3 months before I latched on to the first gig. And it's frustrating and it's scary because when you're not working, you're not earning. But at the same time, once you hit, if you do good work, that network spreads, that reputation spreads. Oh, yeah, Mike did a good job with us, I'll put him in the next one. But and you'll get repeat work from the same companies because you're a known entity at that point, which is the other part of the equation. But you got to have patience on the front end.
Nobody wants to look bad, either referring you individually or a company referring you. So you're maintaining good relationships, doing a good job, reinforcing the job you're doing is really part of generating referrals.
That's absolutely true. And you're only as good as your last gig. So if you have not performed well, own it. But at the same time, if you do good work, there is lots of work out there. The trick is putting yourself in a position, A, to hear about it, and B, to be ready to respond when the time comes. But you also have to be fair to the client. Just because something's dangled out there, no, we need an interim X, you have to be honest with them and with yourself. If this is not something you're likely to be good at, don't accept it. Tell them right up front, it's not really a fit for me, because it does a disservice both to the firm, but also to the client and yourself, because then you'll get the reputation of, oh, he went in there, we paid him this money and nothing happened. So
a lot of people say, well, I'd like to do this, but I'm not going to do this place, that place. I don't want to do. You've been into some challenging places. You're in a very big metropolitan area now, near Manhattan. And a lot that wouldn't be a place that you would go live and move your family.
No, probably not.
Okay. So when people say, well, they start giving you all the places they don't want to go for whatever reason. Have you found that a lot of the places that you thought you probably would not want to do work in, that you've done work there and it was productive and you learned a lot, and
Absolutely. And I've been all over the country. I now have an app called Flighty that shows me every flight I've taken since 2012. And I have 922 flights as of this last Monday, and almost 800,000 miles just here in the United States. But the map that it shows, I've been all over, and part of the fun is, A, it's temporary. So if you're in a place that you really don't like, so what? It's not going to last that long.
This too shall pass.
Right, like a kidney stone. But the other piece is you get to see parts of the world you might not have ever seen before. And there's something new to learn, something interesting anywhere you go. So on my weekends where I'm not traveling home, my rule of thumb is I pick a compass direction and just go explore. And there's always something to see, whether it's cornfields in Nebraska or the Olympic Peninsula or Manhattan. There's always something cool to see. So treat it as an adventure.
Mike Lieb, it's so great to see you. Thank you so very much for joining us today on Self Perspective, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it. It's always good to see you, John.